friend of mine talked about going on vacations with his family's the Ben-Hur tour, referencing the scene in the classic Charlton Heston movie from the late 1950s and the famous chariot race scene where the chariots compete fast and recklessly. This meant that his father, in particular, insisted on seeing and doing as much as possible on their relaxing vacation, as there was time to do, so that they saw a lot, but never had time to really enjoy the experiences. It sort of reminds me of the scene in Vacation where Chevy Chase takes his family to see Grand Canyon, and when they get there, they take a quick look and get on their way. It's really funnier in the movie than I've described. Well, I've known some swimming families who participate in the sort of Ben-Hur tour by going to every meet they can. That's what we're talking about today on the Swim Coach Dad podcast, the Ben-Hur Tour. How many meets? There's too many. I'm Scott Wisner of Victor Swim Club.
Swimming is cool. I go swimming. The sun is burning. I'm yearning for the water.
While I was coaching another club, there was a swimmer, a girl who was 14, who showed a lot of promise. She was very athletic, highly competitive, and for her age, she was very committed to her improvement. Her main flaw was that she had a very involved mother who felt that she should make the decisions on training and competition. Her personal opinion was that since her daughter was at the top of her age group, she should go to as many competitions as possible I'm not exactly sure what her mother thought the purpose was, but it seemed that she wanted her daughter to win as much as possible. I think they must have gone to more than 20 meets in the short course season, and they traveled all over the place, including going to meets in Boston area, Connecticut, Maryland, as well as in Adirondack and Niagara LSCs. It became something of an obsession to go to every meet that they could find in spite of the recommendations and suggestions of the coaching staff. And since her mother was the parent on the team who handled all the meet entries, she entered her daughter in meets, and we didn't really know anything about it. I remember feeling the frustration of seeing her miss practices every week to go to meets and watching the travel and competition take its toll on her swimming. When it came time for the championship meet, the swimmer was very flat in her performances and actually seemed tired at Niagara Championships. She should have been a contender for the 13-14 High Point trophy, but she was tired and not sharp for the meet. Instead, she had a terrible meet and ended up missing out on what really should have been great swims. On the other hand, on the same team, just a little bit before that, there was a swimmer, a 16-year-old girl, who didn't go to swim meets at all. She would come to practice every day, but she never competed in meets, even the ones we hosted at the club. So even when I talked her into swimming an event or two, she would enter but not show up for the meet using some kind of made-up excuse like she had to work or something like that, which I wasn't really ever sure that it was true. In the end, she gave up swimming, having lost interest in just practicing. So how much is the right amount of competition? I've told you about what can happen with going to too many meets and what can happen by going to no meets. So how do you decide how many meets is appropriate? I have a good friend, a mentor, who's been coaching for a lot of years at nearly every level. He told me that a swimmer has his or her best chance to do best times by only swimming one meet a year. But while this is probably true, especially when swimmers are younger, it's counterproductive in several ways. First, you have to understand that going to meets is not about doing best times. That can sometimes be a bonus, but not a reason to go to a meet. To understand how many meets is the right amount, we have to discuss what the purpose of competitions really is. So, we train every group. For all, generally speaking, it involves working towards swimming faster, and it includes various amounts of technical work like how to swim the strokes efficiently, how to start, how to do turns, and how to do these things more efficiently once you already know how to do them. It includes aerobic training and speed training, and training also includes training to race. Now, we've seen the benefit of providing some racing opportunities in practice, especially with test sets and in-practice time trials. But competition involves a particular kind of stress. It also involves race strategy against unknown or at least unfamiliar competition, and it also involves time management and event management. Competition and racing is something that needs to be practiced. There really is no substitute for racing others in a meet. It not only helps hone the skill of racing, but it also tells the swimmers, and really more so the coaches, where the swimmers are in their training and development. Swimming in meets also lets us see what swimmers do when they're competing with their brains shut off and they're just racing. It's helpful to see how swimmers react in meets. Doing smaller meets also gives swimmers a chance to work on their reaction to stress of competition, having to come back right away to swim a second event. It also does a little bit to do some mental toughness training that we talked about last week. So meets serve a lot of functions. You see a lot of swimmers, or at least a lot of swimming parents, think that swimming as many meets as possible and accumulating as many medals as possible is the name of the game. And more dangerously, there are parents and swimmers out there who believe every swim should produce a best time when that really isn't realistic or the purpose of meets. The problem is that there is a lot of evidence that there is a limit on meets being helpful, and going to meets every weekend doesn't allow for any training to take hold. In fact, one of the conflicts I personally have with high school swimming is that there are so many meets so close together. They really serve a far different purpose than what I believe is useful for the development of the swimmer, at least for our purposes. When swimmers come back from high school season, they often tell us they need a break to recover from the stress of high school season. This is really an indication of swimming too many meets than it is swimming too much in general. In a typical high school season, let's say 14 weeks, most teams swim something between 10 to 12 dual meets. There's another meet like conference championships, or for the guys, it's the Yeti Invitational or the Fab Four or whatever some of those invitationals are. And then there's sectionals and states. The first 3 weeks of the season is usually spent training, so no meets. That means you're down to 11 weeks. There's at least 10 to 14 days between the last dual meet and sectionals, so now you're down to 9 weeks for all these meets. So 9 weeks, high school swimmers are competing in 10 dual meets, 2-day prelim and final championship meets, plus an invitational. So there's something like 6 weeks to get in 10 dual meets. So that means the heart of the season, there has to be sometimes 2 or 3 meets per week. It's a lot of competing and not a lot of training. We had a swimmer a couple years ago who swam the same 2 events in high school 16 times during the season in an attempt to break as many pool records as possible. In February and March, during the high school state meet and the LSC and Speedo sectional championship meets, he wasn't very sharp and started showing really signs of doing too much with some physical injuries and other byproduct of doing too many meets. Now, I'm not saying to anyone that they shouldn't swim high school. I want to be clear on that. I'm just using that concentrated season to show that too much racing can cause some problems. It's why swimmers come back to the club after high school season and feel like they need a break. All that stress from racing 2 or 3 meets per week takes a toll even on older swimmers. According to one study done by the American Swimming Coaches Association a few years ago, of the swimmers who were ranked in the top 100 as 10 and under swimmers, only 10.3% of girls and 13.2% of boys were in the top 100 as 17 and 18-year-olds. A lot of the time that's because 10 and unders are doing more of everything at a much younger age. More training, more yardage, more meets. And doing more that young isn't necessarily an advantage. For 11 and 12-year-olds in the top 100 at that age group, only 20.3% of the girls and 12.6% of the boys in that group were in the top 100 as 17 and 18-year-olds. The reason for these differences is that training and competing at a more intense, more specialized level early in any sport, it stops being fun. The rub is that of the very top of the sport, the most elite, 0.001%, more or less, of the competitive swimmers start early and specialize early. That's the very top of the sport. But what about the other 99.999% of the swimmers who don't become elite? We know that pushing the vast majority of swimmers too young will cause almost all of them to leave the sport. So we need swimmers to go to meets enough to see how they do in terms of racing, to see where they are in their development, see where they are in terms of conditioning, but not so much as to make swimming meets painful. So what about the swimmer who didn't want to compete, just wanted to go to swim practice and train? The problem is competition is what puts meaning into practices. If you're a swimmer, competition is part of that. At least it should be. I often say when we train, we're practicing for competition. The senior kids will always groan when I say, hey, we're training for something. We're training to swim fast in meets. If a swimmer isn't competing, motivation to practice becomes pretty difficult, and the meaning of what we're doing in practice is lacking for them. So there needs to be some amount of competition to give the training that meaning. One of our senior swimmers had a rough patch a couple years ago, and it seemed like she was going to quit swimming. She came back, but only wanted to train for a while. Her practices lacked intensity and purposes during that time. She went about 8 months before she competed, and when she came back, she was really out of practice and competing. Took about 6 more months of going to meets periodically before she was really back to where she was before her break. So if she had competed a little and kept it in perspective, just understood what the purpose of meets was, it might have helped her come back sooner. So with regard to swim meets, we're in a kind of a different time. We're in a very unique time that's never happened really at least in modern swimming history. Since March 15th of 2020, we haven't been able to go to a meet. And so that's about 10 months, more or less, without competition. So we need to figure out how to put meaning into the training we're doing, or hopefully we will be doing soon. It all has to point to the inevitability that we'll be competing sometime and how we should be preparing, including racing as much as we can in practices. And even with that, swimmers will still need to have a few meets to be race sharp. They'll have to go to a few early on when we can get back to meets and just get that racing mentality back. The real answer is to swim meets when they make sense, and that's the answer to our question of how many meets is too many. Let's take the senior swimmers. The first 9 weeks of the short course season, we're building aerobic base. Partway through that process, we need to see where everyone is as far as getting in aerobic shape after the long course season. Call it taking their temperature or just doing a quick check. So in October, normally, late October, we're doing a meet, probably our own meet at Victor, where we're seeing where everybody is. Then by mid to late November, another meet is needed before the mid-season rest meet. So usually somewhere around the weekend before Thanksgiving, we're looking for a meet to just see where we are as far as conditioning goes, so that we can do how much resting we're going to need to do before the rest meet. Then we do the rest meet in December, usually Junior Nationals or the Star Invitational, and we go back to work right after that. And we swim the Victor meet the first of the year to get some more racing in while we are in the heaviest part of training. So we're swimming them when they're broken down and beat up a little bit. After that, we go until the middle of February in another high-level meet, the Region 1 meet in Schenectady, for another pre-taper meet. After that, it's LSC Championships in mid-March, and then either Eastern Zones or Speedo Sectionals to finish off the short course season. For senior prep, their season will look similarly, but a few more race opportunities are needed. Mid-October, then early November and late November, early December, and then a break to train before the first of the year. One more meet in late January, probably. One in late February, such as the LSC Championship Qualifier, or Silvers as it's called, or some other meet. And then for those qualifying for LSC Championships or the GVSL meet as a season championship meet. It ends up with a meet every 3 or 4 weeks. For the long course season, there are different reasons to swim in meets. First of all, we should be only swimming meets held in long course pools. So since we aren't trained that much that way, meets have to serve as our exposure to long course pools. As well, the season is very compact. Meets usually start in late May, go until maybe the end of July or early August, and that includes futures and senior zones and junior nationals. So going to meets more often, about every 2 weeks, is necessary. So this is true for most of the levels, but the very newest, like developmental and intermediate, don't need to go to meets quite that often in the summer. And it's a lot harder for you guys to find meeting and meets when there's so many of them. So we try and do that, but we're mostly talking about the short course season, because that's really when we have the most problem with kids swimming too many meets. Okay, so how many meets are too many again? For the more experienced swimmers, usually in the senior group, we like to have our swimmers swim a meet every 4 to 6 weeks, as I pointed out. There are times when they'll swim more often, like during championship seasons. So our senior swimmers might swim the Region 1 meet in February, the LSC Championships in mid-March, and then Speedos or Eastern Zones at the end of March. One of the reasons we prefer to have our senior swimmers compete every 4 to 6 weeks is so we have more time to train rather than going to meets. Senior level swimmers should, in normal times, have enough experience with meets, so the purpose for the meet is for them to keep racing sharp for the end of the season meets, and not really necessarily to learn how to manage. We expect them to know that by then. For senior prep swimmers, we should compete a bit more every 3 or 4 weeks, as they usually have a little bit less experience, and most of those should be one-day meets where they're just seeing where they are in terms of training. And we want our swimmers to swim in our meets, obviously, so there are a couple right there, givens. And like the senior swimmers, they're built in, and they can serve very well just to see where everybody is and get some racing in. Okay, for performance, the performance swimmers might need a little more competition, but they're of the age where this whole going to too many meets can get away from them. So if they go to a meet like the Eastern Zone IMX meet, then another meet should come off their schedule so that it balances out. Swimming a meet, on average, throughout short course season, about every 3 weeks is okay. Most of those should be no more than an hour from home, and most should be meets where you aren't staying in a hotel overnight or away from home. Yeah, and we also get that, for the performance kids and even actually senior prep or senior swimmers, sometimes making the qualifying times for a meet like LSC championships or for the older kids speedos, sometimes that's a surprise, and you just have to take that as it is. I mean, you make you have a great meet at LSCs, you make the speedo sectional cut, and all of a sudden you're going to speedo sectionals as another meet. So you just kind of have to keep that in mind, that some things do change during the season. For performance swimmers, same way. If you're someone that may not make LSC championships and all of a sudden last meet you do, well, then that's another meet for you, and it's not really a big deal. It's just the fact that that's kind of what you're working towards anyways. So for developmental and intermediate swimmers, this is a big part of the learning of the sport. So those swimmers can compete a little more often, maybe a couple times a month, but no more than an hour from home. And unless there's really a good reason to do otherwise, like a grandparent who lives in a particular place where we're going to a meet, you really should keep to that. We do have some of those kids that are making LSC championships, and so that's a bonus meet, let's say. But for the most part, we want to keep them so that it's still fun and they're not competing, super a lot. They do need to have competition because they're learning, but we really do need to have them kind of keep it in perspective and not go crazy. A couple other things. We really want to have coaches at meets where we have our swimmers. A lot of times, especially with that one young lady at a club that I coached that was going to all the meets, she went to a lot of meets where we didn't have a coach going. And so I always had to run around making arrangements for someone to watch her because, someone needs to be responsible for swimmers on deck. But also, I kind of needed somebody to watch her that I knew, that I could, hear from and how she did and what she did and all that stuff. It's important that someone from our staff is on deck normally to see the swimmers, how they're doing and how they're progressing. And then it doesn't mean that their group coach has to be there at every meet. And since we all have slightly different perspectives, it's sometimes very helpful to have another coach from the staff watch swimmers to get their opinion on ways to improve. But we really do want to have a coach on deck. So make sure it's meets that we're going to as a team. First time I took my son to Futures Championships in Greensboro, North Carolina. A week later, my wife was going to take our daughter to Eastern Zones, age group zones, the long course meet in Richmond. So after Futures, I hopped on a plane and headed home and had to go back to my job on Monday morning and then go out of town for a few days. And then so since we didn't want our son to be home alone, he headed up to Richmond with another swimming friend to meet up with my wife and his sister at Zones and decided as long as he was there, he's going to swim the meet. So as it turned out, it was a great meet for him, and he made his first junior cut there when he was supposed to kind of make it at Futures. I kind of felt like my wife might have done a better job coaching him, or the zone staff did, because he made his cut there and at Zones instead of at Futures, but it also might have been because he was relaxed. But sometimes going to championship meets back to back can be helpful, like it was in this case, where he just had a little bit more rest and he had, he was a little bit more comfortable in the competition. The competition was a little bit lower level, it wasn't easy, but it was still, something he could manage and he could really race well. So the point is that we know that siblings are often in different groups and in different places in their development. So you try to go to meets where all the siblings can swim in the same meet. We've got one family, I don't know how they keep all four of them going to the same meets. Those kind of accommodations can be made as long as they're planned for and as long as we talk about it. It's not that hard to do. It's just the fact that we do need to kind of keep it, keep the communication open. Basically, the bottom line is that newer swimmers can compete more because they're learning about racing and meets while they're competing. We also want them to get used to competing. We don't want them to be afraid of it. The more they do it, the more comfortable they're going to get in that setting. more experienced or, like say, older swimmers don't need to go to as many meets, but they need to go to meets periodically to stay race sharp, so they can actually, when they do need to swim well, they can. So, and as I've said, the older swimmers do need to spend more time training. So for them, if they're at a lot of meets, they aren't able to train. If they're going to a meet, they have to leave Friday, and they're swimming Saturday and Sunday. That means they're missing Friday evenings practice and then Saturday practice, which is really kind of a lot in the grand scheme of things. We don't train as much as a lot of teams do. So the real answer to how many meets is too many is talk to your coach about it. Plan out which meets during the season you should be going to and which ones you don't have to go to. We're usually telling people what groups we want to go to each meet. So you'll be amazed how much fun swimming really is when you aren't on the Ben-Hur Swim Meet Tour. Thanks for listening. Join me again next time when I'm going to talk about how stress makes swimming not fun in a podcast called Chasing Records and Qualifying Times and Other Ways to Hate the Sport. Until then, this is Victor Swim Club coach Scott Wisner for the Swim Coach Dad podcast, reminding you to find some place to keep swimming.